The sky above western Yunnan carried a strange stillness that morning, the kind that only forms before violence. Wisps of high-altitude haze drifted across the blue, scattering sunlight into faint silver veils. Far beneath it, the jagged green ridges of the Hengduan Mountains rose like the spines of an enormous buried creature. Rivers glinted between them, cutting pale ribbons through valleys that had seen centuries of untouched quiet, and now trembled under the weight of war. Flying alone above this ancient landscape was a single P-40 Warhawk, its olive-drab skin faded by months of sun and monsoon. The aircraft moved with a steady determination, its Allison V1710 engine sending a deep vibration through the cockpit frame. Captain William Hawk Miller kept one gloved hand resting loosely on the control stick, letting the Warhawk ride the air mass as it slowly climbed toward its patrol altitude. He had flown this route countless times, enough to recognize every rocky ridge, every sharp bend in the river, every pocket of turbulence that rose out of the valleys like invisible fists. He expected another quiet sweep, another lonely, uneventful stretch of sky. The China theater was unpredictable, but even unpredictability has rhythms. Some days carried tension, others emptiness. Today felt empty, at least at first. It changed in a heartbeat. Miller saw the flicker before he understood it, a pinprick of reflected light on the distant horizon, too bright and too steady to be cloud glint. Then another, and another. A thin chain of lights stretched across the sky like beads on a wire. He squinted through the canopy, adjusting angle, shading his eyes with the edge of his hand. The chain thickened, the beads multiplied. And then the truth arrived with sickening clarity. They were not beads. They were wings, layer on layer of wings. What emerged over the horizon did not resemble a patrol or a hunt or even a disciplined combat wing. It was a mass, a full towering wedge of Japanese fighters, Ki-43 Oscars, Ki-44 Tojos, advancing in a concentration so large it distorted the air, shimmering like heat above a jungle road. 60, maybe more, far more. Their spacing, altitude layering, and formation geometry revealed everything. This was not a harassment flight or a reconnaissance escort. This was a strike wave, an overwhelming fist aimed directly at Allied positions, planned with the intention of crushing resistance through sheer volume and speed. And Miller was the only American fighter in the sky. His mind did not race. It narrowed. The shock compressed into a single hard beat of recognition. He had flown directly into the path of a force designed to wipe out an airfield, not duel a lone fighter. There was no one behind him, no second element, no squadron scrambling to meet him in the sky. Just one Warhawk, and 64 enemy fighters marching across the sky like an armored tide. He adjusted his throttle, feeling the engine respond with a muscular roar. The Warhawk rose another 100 feet, the metal skin trembling as its frame bit into the thinner air. He could feel the weight of the scene pressing into him, the impossible scale of the formation, the sheer cold logic of the moment. There are moments in war when survival becomes secondary to purpose, moments when a pilot doesn't measure odds, but consequences. If those fighters broke through, Kunming would burn. The hump supply line would fracture. China's last operational lifelines would shatter. And no one else was here to delay them. A strange stillness settled over him, not peace, not fatalism, but something sharper. A clarity, born not from courage, but from inevitability. The kind of clarity men only find when they realize that the world has shrunk to the space inside their cockpit, and the moment happening right now. The Japanese fighters spread their formation slightly, preparing to descend into attack posture. Their wings glittered. Their engines glowed. The spear was forming. Miller angled his Warhawk higher, taking position above the far left edge of the oncoming storm. One aircraft, 64 enemies, and a sky about to ignite. He exhaled once, and flew straight toward them. The origins of this confrontation stretched far beyond the ridgelines of Yunnan. It began months earlier against maps, shortages, and a war fought in slow starvation. China had been bleeding since 1937. Entire provinces had been burned into ash, airfields moved like drifting islands. built overnight, destroyed by morning. And the fragile world that kept China alive depended on an improbable, perilous artery. The hump. Flying the hump meant crossing the Himalayas in aircraft overloaded with fuel, engines straining in thin air, storms ripping across peaks like spinning knives. Yet every day, American transports forced their way over the mountains to deliver a few thousand gallons of fuel, a crate, 50 cal ammo, a crate of food, whatever could fit. It was not a supply chain, it was a lifeline made of turbulence and hope. If the Japanese severed that lifeline, the entire theater would collapse. Kunming, nestled in the central mountains, was the beating heart of Allied logistics in China. Its airfields stored everything that made war possible: aviation fuel, artillery shells, spare engines, replacement aircraft frames. Destroy Kunming's infrastructure, and the hump effort would crumble. Destroy the hump, and China would fold. If China folded, Japan could redirect armies, air wings, and fleets against the Pacific in numbers the United States could not match. Japan knew this, and the pilots of the 25th and 50th Sentai had been waiting for a moment like today, when the patrol schedule slipped just enough for a coordinated strike force to break through. The 23rd Fighter Group, famous successor to Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, was stretched thin beyond reason. Supply shortages meant engines ran well past their recommended lifespan, pilots rotated 3, sometimes 4 missions a day, maintenance crews worked under lantern light until their hands cramped. Every serviceable fighter was a triumph, every takeoff was a gamble, every safe landing a quiet miracle. Captain William Hawk Miller had flown almost every day for weeks. His P-40 carried patches of mismatched metal along its belly where shrapnel or tracer rounds had torn through and been hammered back into shape by hand, often by crewmen who hadn't slept in a day and a half. Still, the aircraft held together, rugged machines for rugged pilots. Before the war, Miller had been an instructor back home, calm, methodical, precise. But China changed him into something else. Experience replaced caution. Fatigue hardened skill into instinct. He no longer thought about maneuvers, he simply flew them. He no longer calculated risk, he sensed it. The sky had narrowed his world until only fuel, airspeed, angle, and survival mattered. He also understood the Japanese. Their fighters were lighter, faster in the climb, sharper in the turn. They were built for a kind of aerial knife fighting the Warhawk could never match. But they were fragile. Wings so thin you could see sunlight glow through them, airframes so lightly constructed that a single well-placed burst could tear them apart. Japan built its fighters for agility. America built the P-40 for endurance. Agility versus durability. Precision versus punishment. A contest of philosophies written in steel. The Japanese strike today was not random. The skies had grown unusually quiet the night before. No probing raids, no reconnaissance skirmishes. Even the Chinese villagers who carried baskets of yams past the airfield fences sensed the stillness. They believed the spirits of the mountains whispered warnings in the wind. Pilots believed something different. Silence in wartime usually meant someone was planning thunder. When the radar stations south of Kunming misreported a formation as unknown, possibly transport, no alarms were raised. It was the kind of mistake that happened in a theater with aging equipment and operators who hadn't slept in proper beds in months. The Japanese saw the opening immediately. Hay assembled 64 fighters from scattered bases, forming 3 layers of attack groups. Ki-43 Oscars made up the bulk, swift, nimble dogfighters with excellent turn rates. But sprinkled between them were Ki-44 Tojos, faster, more heavily armed interceptors meant to crush anything that got in their way. Together they were designed to hit Kunming with overwhelming precision. The strike was timed down to the minute. They expected little resistance. Certainly not a lone P-40 rising from the west, painted in faded olive drab and scarred from weeks of combat. Yet that is exactly what fate delivered, a single American fighter in the perfect position at the perfect moment to see the entire attack wave forming over the horizon. The weight of that responsibility, knowing he alone had seen the blade before it fell, settled into Miller's chest like a stone. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He wasn't thinking about odds. He wasn't thinking about how many would remember his actions. He was thinking about the fuel farms at Kunming, the barrels of aviation gasoline, the rows of parked aircraft, still cold from the night, the Chinese laborers, moving crates across wooden ramps, the American crews eating breakfast in tin-roofed mess tents, all of them unaware of the storm racing toward them. He steadied the Warhawk. The Japanese formation continued its advance. The moment of interception drew closer with every breath, and behind his calm exterior, a single realization crystallized: there was no time for hesitation. There was only time for action. The horizon thickened as Miller closed the distance, the once distant specks becoming a living organism of metal and motion. The Japanese formation was no longer an abstraction, no longer a collection of glints and silhouettes. It was a vast, layered machine cutting across the morning sky with an almost ceremonial precision. Every gleam of sunlight off a canopy, every faint shimmer of wings, announced the approach of a force built to overwhelm, not negotiate. The air grew sharper the closer he flew. Thin cold currents flowed down from the higher altitudes, brushing against the Warhawk's frame like invisible fingers. Miller adjusted the mixture, feeling the engine respond with a deeper, more stable growl. The cockpit smelled faintly of oil and heated metal. His oxygen mask clung to his face, the world narrowing into the tight cone of his vision and the slow drumbeat of his breath. Below him, Yunnan's labyrinth of mountains shifted in patterns he had memorized months ago. Long, forested ridges gave way to sudden cliffs. Steep valleys folded into one another like crumpled green fabric. The terrain was brutal, yet familiar. It had been the backdrop of every mission he had flown. Today it would witness something else entirely. The Japanese fighters began to rearrange themselves. Their outer edges contracted inward. Their inner layers thickened. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. They had identified him. His presence had moved from a distant anomaly to a confirmed threat. Several Oscars on the outer rim tilted slightly, adjusting their positions to enter a shallow intercept angle. Their movements were deliberate, pushing out like fingers probing an unexpected object in the dark. Miller felt the pressure of altitude on his lungs, the mask cycling air in slow, controlled bursts. His heartbeat steadied, matching the low rumble of the Allison engine. Clarity washed over him again, that same sharpened calm he had felt the instant he recognized the incoming wave. In war, fear rarely vanished. It simply moved aside to make space for necessity. He rolled the Warhawk slightly to the left, testing the responsiveness of the control surfaces. The aircraft answered with the heavy, grounded stability he relied on. Unlike the Japanese fighters, light, nimble, almost eager to turn, the P-40 carried weight in every movement. At first glance, that weight seemed a disadvantage, but to Miller, it was a shield. The Warhawk did not disintegrate under stress. It did not tear itself apart in high-speed dives. It stayed intact, even when pushed far beyond its design comfort. Altitude was running out. Distance was shrinking. Intent was becoming undeniable. He studied the Japanese formation again. At the highest tier were the Tojos. Sleek, fast, designed to climb aggressively and crush any opposition with sheer velocity. Their squared-off wings and larger frames stood out clearly, even at range. Beneath them, forming the massive bulk of the wave, were the Oscars, graceful, curved-wing fighters, their outlines soft but unmistakable. Beneath that, near the cloud line, a smaller layer of reserve fighters waited, still holding transit posture, likely saving fuel for post-strike pursuit operations. This wasn't just a strike. This was an orchestrated assault. The Japanese did not send 60-plus fighters unless they were confident their timing and secrecy were perfect. Their intelligence had predicted Allied gaps precisely. Patrol schedules had been misaligned. Radar misread them. The American fighters scheduled for dawn patrol were still on the ground warming engines, except for him. A single anomaly in an otherwise perfect Japanese plan. He continued climbing until he reached the point where the Warhawk's engine leaned into a tight metallic whine, right on the edge of optimal performance. The air thinned, the sunlight sharpened, but Miller pushed for a few more feet, knowing every meter gained in altitude was a unit of stored energy he would later spend like currency. Higher meant faster dives. Faster dives meant deadlier passes, and deadly passes were the only thing that could fracture a machine built from 64 pieces. He eased his breathing, feeling the cold mask draw tighter around his face. The Japanese fighter elements were now large enough to distinguish not just wings and fuselages, but the glint of cockpit glass, even the faint shadow of squadron markings on their tails. They were close. Close enough that he could feel the electric tension between two converging forces. Close enough that silence became a sound of its own. In that suspended moment before contact, a single truth settled inside him with absolute clarity. He would strike first. He would strike hard. And however long he lasted, the Japanese timeline would break because of him. He tightened his grip on the stick, leveled the nose, and angled the P-40 into a clean predatory posture. The last breath before the sky turned violet. The battle was seconds away, and he flew straight into it. The moment Miller committed to the dive, the world changed shape. The sky that had seconds earlier felt wide and distant, folded inward, tightening around the Warhawk as the nose dipped and gravity surged against his shoulders. The Allison engine roared, a deep primal bellow pushed into a higher register by thin air and rising speed. Wind clawed along the fuselage, the canopy trembling with the pressure of descent. The Japanese formation continued its deliberate advance, unaware that the first blow was already falling on them. Their movement was elegant in its precision, fighters arranged in staggered lines designed to ensure mutual coverage, but no formation, no matter how disciplined, could maintain perfect cohesion when a threat came screaming down from the edge of its vision. Miller did not aim at the center. He aimed at the seam. Every formation had one, a space where the outer flank widened just slightly, where two layers overlapped imperfectly, where pilots trusted the geometry of the group more than the air in front of them. Hitting the core wasted time. Hitting the seam caused fractures. He aligned the P-40 with that exact weakness. The ground rushed upward. Distant mountains, flattening into shifting layers of shadow and light. Airspeed climbed. Altitude peeled away in long, fast strips. The Warhawk felt heavy yet unstoppable, a steel hammer guided by instinct rather than calculation. The first Oscar grew rapidly in his gun sight, its curved wings glittering, its pilot surely relaxed, unaware of death arriving at nearly 400 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot began a casual left adjustment, following the rhythm of the formation, not yet recognizing the shape diving toward him. Miller steadied the sight. The Warhawk trembled. Energy flooded the aircraft. He fired. Tracer lines lanced downward in clean burning arcs, punching into the Oscar's wing root. The thin metal structure disintegrated instantly, collapsing inward like it had been sliced with invisible shears. The fighter rolled abruptly, engine coughing black smoke, and dropped from the formation trailing a spiraling ribbon of flame. Before the debris even finished falling, Miller pulled through the dive, the P-40 cutting a brutal path through the outer edge of the Japanese wave. His sudden intrusion forced multiple fighters to break formation, some banking sharply upward, others diving away in panic reflex, their neat geometry dissolving into momentary chaos. He did not celebrate the hit. He was already climbing again. Using the energy of the dive, Miller angled the Warhawk upward in a long, sweeping ascent that placed him above the fractured flank. His goal was not to dogfight. Dogfighting against 60 opponents was suicide. His goal was to wound the formation, force it to stretch, splinter, and collapse under its own weight. As he climbed, two Japanese fighters reacted fast enough to give chase. Their engines wailed at higher pitch, lighter airframes, allowing them to close distance quickly. Miller felt their presence behind him, not through sight, but through instinct, and the subtle shift in the air pressure as their propeller wash intersected his slipstream. He did not turn. Turning meant surrendering energy. Turning meant entering their domain. Instead, he climbed a few hundred more feet, just enough to tilt the scales in his favor. before rolling the Warhawk onto its back in a smooth, controlled inversion. The world inverted with him. Mountains flipped upside down. The Japanese fighters suddenly filled the upper half of his canopy. And then he dove again. The Warhawk dropped like a thrown spear. Air screamed past the canopy seals. The engine howled under the strain. The Japanese fighters above tried to follow, but the P-40's weight gave it an advantage in terminal descent. Miller pulled the sight onto the nearest target. Another Oscar trying to correct its trajectory, but too slow, too exposed, too committed to the chase. He pulled the trigger in a short, brutal burst. The rounds tore through the Oscar's fuselage, blowing a panel clean off and severing control surfaces in a spray of metal fragments. The aircraft pitched violently and broke apart, disappearing in a cloud of twisting shards. 2 strikes, 2 fractures. The formation was no longer whole. Dozens of fighters swarmed now, rising and diving in confused arcs as they tried to determine direction and intention. Their initial attack timeline was slipping. Their cohesion was fraying. Their commanders were forced to shift from precision strike to reactive pursuit, a psychological pivot that cost them minutes they could not afford. Miller leveled off and climbed again, pulling the Warhawk into another altitude advantage before the next wave of fighters converged. He felt the tremor of adrenaline running through him, but kept his breathing steady, letting the cold mask regulate what fear tried to disrupt. This wasn't a duel. This wasn't even combat. This was disruption. Pure, calculated delay. He had struck the first blow, and the sky was only beginning to break. The moment the Japanese formation snapped out of its disciplined advance, the sky erupted into a chaos that defied geometry. The neat, lethal symmetry of 64 fighters collapsed into a storm of shifting angles, interlocking arcs, and violent pivots. The air seemed alive, trembling with the vibrations of dozens of engines accelerating, banking, diving, all hunting the single American fighter that had shattered their timeline. Miller's Warhawk shot upward in a long, punishing climb, the air thinning around him, the frame shaking under strain. Below, the swarm moved like a stirred nest, Oscars peeling off in 2s and 3s, Tojos slicing through gaps with predatory confidence. They were everywhere at once, silver slashes against a harsh blue canvas. He could feel it before he saw it, the tightening of the pursuit net. It began with a simple pressure in his periphery, a shift in the quality of the wind buffeting his left wing. Japanese pilots were converging from multiple vectors, trying to shepherd him downward into the densest layer of the formation where speed and altitude would no longer save him. He refused the trap. Instead of defending the position the swarm expected him to hold, Miller abruptly dropped the Warhawk's nose and rolled into a steep, spiraling descent, a maneuver that carried enormous risk. Diving into a mass of enemy fighters was madness on paper, but doing so created something the Japanese formation was not built to handle: unpredictable vertical chaos. The P-40 plummeted, slicing through alternating bands of sunlight and shadow as it crossed through cloud traces and exhaust wakes. The air shrieked around the fuselage. The altimeter spun. The world blurred. Directly ahead, 3 Oscars converged by coincidence, each banking into the same corridor of sky. They were not prepared for a hostile aircraft to drop into their path at over 350 miles per hour. Miller steadied the gun sight long enough to catch a sweep of fragile wings drifting into alignment. He fired a short, savage burst, a line of tracers stitched across the central Oscar's fuselage, ripping through its light frame. The aircraft folded into itself and vanished downward in a burning arc. The 2 fighters on its flanks jerked apart in shock, their formation instinctively breaking. His descent violated every safe principle of air combat. But it worked. The swarm fractured even further. Tracers sliced past his canopy, thin, glowing threads that passed so close he could feel the Warhawk's skin resonate from the near misses. The Japanese pilots, now fully committed, reacted with accelerating aggression. They weren't merely chasing him, they were corralling him. At least 8 fighters dove in pursuit from above, each one jockeying for the perfect firing angle. The sky behind the Warhawk glittered like a hive of metallic insects, each one twitching with lethal intent, the air filled with the faint tremor of synchronized dives as the swarm closed around him. Miller leveled out barely a few 100 feet above the ridge tops, the ground a blur of green jaggedness racing beneath him. Trees whipped by in long smears, valleys flashed open and vanished. His proximity to terrain reduced the firing angles available to the swarm, but it also steals seconds from the Japanese attack timeline. Seconds were what he needed. As the first wave of Oscars dove to meet him, he executed a harsh roll and climb combination, slamming upward in a brutal reversal that pressed him deep into his seat. The Warhawk's frame groaned, rivets straining, but the advantage was immediate. The Japanese fighters overshot, dropping past him in a cascade of confusion, desperate to correct their trajectories. He pulled up behind the lowest of the overshooting fighters, its tail still wobbling from the violent overshoot. The maneuver cost him precious seconds of energy, but it presented a fleeting opportunity. He fired. The round slammed into the Oscar's engine cowling, igniting a burst of black smoke that billowed like ink into the sky. 4 kills now. But the scoreboard meant nothing. The swarm was everywhere. Tightening again. Dozens of fighters reformed into partial subgroups, trying to compress him into a box of intersecting firing lines. He forced the Warhawk upward once more, taking his machine to the edge of stall control. The aircraft vibrated, trembling near the point of aerodynamic failure, but Miller held it there, hovering close to the stall threshold where the Japanese fighters' lightweight frames struggled to follow cleanly. An Oscar tried anyway. It overshot. He banked. It appeared in his gun sight for a fraction of a moment. Another burst, another violent bloom of debris. Miller didn't count the kill. He didn't have time. He angled right, diving again, crossing directly through the airspace where several Japanese fighters were converging from different altitudes. Their movements collided, not physically, but operationally. Each expected the American fighter to behave like a cornered animal, predictable, defensive, shrinking toward safety. He did the opposite. He broke their assumptions like glass. The Warhawk screamed into the vertical space between two converging fighters. Both Japanese pilots jerked away, braking hard to avoid collision. Those breakaways rippled outward, forcing another pair of fighters to split, then another. The swarm was coming undone. Yet the danger was still overwhelming. Too many aircraft, too many angles, too many guns pointing at a single point in the sky. A burst of machine gun fire shredded the left side of his fuselage. Warning lights flickered. Another burst cracked against his tail assembly, punching small ragged holes through the elevator surfaces. The Warhawk shook violently, its once smooth control surfaces now vibrating with structural fatigue, but the aircraft held, stubborn, loyal, still climbing when it should have died. Every second the Warhawk remained airborne was another second stripped from the Japanese strike timeline. Their attack plan, designed for precision, had been replaced with a chaotic chase across the mountains, their formation shattered, their fuel windows disrupted, their momentum bleeding away. Miller was not winning. He was outnumbered 60-1. No amount of skill could flip that ratio, but he was ruining their plan, and that mattered more than survival. By now the swarm no longer resembled a formation. It was a scattered constellation of fighters, angry, confused, forced into an improvised pursuit they never expected. Miller looked ahead, saw a thin band of cloud, felt the Warhawk's wounded frame still responding. He would go in again, but deeper. The battle had become something else now, not a duel, not a mission, a resistance, a lone violent refusal to let 64 fighters cross the sky unchallenged, and he flew straight into the storm again. The deeper Miller pushed into the chaos, the more the sky began to feel like a collapsing tunnel. What had once been open air now compressed around him, the freedom of altitude traded for a maze of blind angles and tightening margins. Every climb cost him energy. Every dive cost him altitude, and every second that passed chipped away at the illusion that the Warhawk could endure this forever. The damage accumulated quietly at first, a stutter in the tail, a faint vibration along the left wing root, the sound of metal rasping where bullets had torn through cowling. Then the effects began to compound. The Warhawk's controls felt heavier. Its stability wavered during sharp banking turns. The engine, once a reliable hammering pulse, now oscillated under strain, coughing each time Miller demanded too much throttle. He knew the symptoms. He knew the limits. And he knew he was nearing both. The fuel gauge confirmed what instinct already whispered. His margin was evaporating. Each desperate climb to regain the energy needed for high-angle reversals drained the tank faster. Each high-power dive consumed oil and fuel at rates that cut deeply into his survival window. The needle dipped in steady increments, a countdown he could neither slow nor ignore. But the Japanese fighters were showing signs of strain too. What had begun as a precise, disciplined strike force had dissolved into a chaotic storm of aircraft out of position, out of sync, and out of time. The fighters that remained close to him flew less aggressively now, their movements betraying an undercurrent of caution. Their leaders must have understood the situation. The longer they chased him, the more fuel they burned, and the further they drifted from their intended attack path. This was the moment Miller had been fighting for, the invisible pivot point where the outcome of a battle shifts without a single shot being fired. A Tojo dove in front of him, cutting a sharp intercept arc. Its pilot was skilled, choosing an angle that forced Miller either to pull into a vertical climb, exposing himself, or roll out of his current trajectory and surrender the altitude advantage. In any other situation, that Tojo would have locked him into a perfect pincer. But Miller anticipated the trap. He pulled the Warhawk upward in a half-loop, not to escape the Tojo, but to drag it into a maneuver it couldn't complete. The P-40's heavy frame, so often a disadvantage, now acted as a deceptive pivot. The Tojo tried to follow, overcommitting its climb, expecting the Warhawk to stall. Instead, Miller punched the nose downward at the last second, preserving what little energy remained. The Tojo shot skyward past him, its pilot suddenly exposed in an unwanted vertical position. Miller steadied the sight, fired a controlled burst, shattered the Tojo's wing root. The Japanese fighter spiraled downward, trailing fire. He didn't count it. He hardly even looked at it. All that mattered now was time. Time stolen. Time disrupted. Time won. The remaining fighters wove around him in frustrated sweeps. Their advantage in numbers was turning into a liability. Dozens of aircraft chasing a single target had created a frenzy of misaligned angles and overlapping flight paths. They were fighting the sky as much as they were fighting him. Yet even as the tide of pressure shifted, one truth remained immovable. He was still alone, still wounded, still bleeding altitude, fuel, and strength. The Warhawk trembled hard as he pulled through another evasive arc. One wing dipped suddenly, betraying structural strain. The controls felt looser than before, sloppy, imprecise. The aircraft was beginning to reach the point where battle damage outpaced aerodynamic forgiveness. His lungs ached from the cold air. His arms burned from constant resistance. His eyes stung from sweat and dryness, and unbroken concentration. Exhaustion crept into the edges of his awareness. Slow, invasive, dangerous. He pushed it back. He had to. Below him, the mountains widened into a deep valley, the terrain becoming more open. The Japanese fighters recognized it instantly, a terrain where they could finally attempt to swarm him again. They moved to spread out, rising and descending into angles they'd lost during the chaotic chase. Some regained altitude, others banked outward to encircle. Their commanders were forcing a reset. He could almost feel it, that thin shift in the wind that signaled a return to order. The swarm was rebuilding. Soon he would be trapped again. Soon the sheer scale of their numbers would crush any advantage he'd bled so hard to gain. But they were forgetting something. A truth so small it almost went unnoticed in the frenzy. They had burned too much fuel. They were too far from their attack path. Their windows were closing. High above the valley, Miller caught sight of it. Tiny glints to the east, faint but unmistakable. American reinforcements. Scrambled fighters. A second wave lifting off from Kunming. The pressure in his chest eased. Not relief, not triumph, but vindication. The chaos he'd created had cost the Japanese the time they needed. They had lost the strike window. They knew it. He knew it. And the sky itself seemed to echo the shift. The turning point had arrived not in a single shot or a sudden kill, but in the invisible physics of fuel consumption, timing, and willpower. He had survived long enough, fought long enough, disrupted long enough, and though the battle wasn't over, the impossible had already been achieved. The swarm, once unstoppable, was beginning to fall apart. The swarm that had once moved as a single organism was unraveling, where there had been a wall of metal and discipline. Now there were only fragments, clusters of fighters flying in disjointed arcs, searching for a target that refused to die. The Japanese attack plan, so meticulously timed, now bore the unmistakable signs of collapse. Altitude windows had been wasted, fuel estimates shattered. The timing that should have carried them cleanly to Kunming was gone. Miller climbed again, slowly now, the Warhawk shaking with every foot gained. The aircraft's wounds were catching up to it. The engine's once confident roar faltered into sporadic vibrations, as if each revolution required negotiation. The airframe creaked under stress. A trail of oil misted across his canopy in faint streaks, shimmering black in the sunlight. He was approaching the edge, not just of the battle, of the machine itself. And yet, in that weakening effort, he saw something the Japanese pilots couldn't see: hope. Far in the east, nearly brushing the sunlit glare, a line of faint glimmers appeared. Small, rhythmic flashes at first, then clearer, sharper, more defined. Their silhouettes were unmistakable. P-40C, P-51ers. More American fighters climbing hard, engines beating across the valley like distant drums. Reinforcements. The cavalry rising into the sky. The sight hit Miller with a quiet force, not as relief, but as confirmation. His delay had worked. His resistance had bought the time they needed. The Japanese pilots reacted quickly when the new threat became visible. Their formations quivered, then pivoted in instinctive retreat patterns. They weren't afraid of a fight. They simply understood the mathematics. Their fuel was lower than planned. Their timing was broken. Their window for coordinated attack had closed. Miller watched as the once overwhelming force began to peel away in layers. Some broke left, racing back toward their launch bases. Others banked upward into the sun, choosing altitude to escape pursuit. A few lingered, reluctant to abandon a kill that had consumed so much of their attention. They circled warily, still hunting the wounded Warhawk like wolves refusing to leave a limping stag. He didn't run from them. Instead, he angled the Warhawk slightly east, keeping altitude but closing the gap between himself and the advancing American fighters. Not out of fear, out of strategy. A wounded aircraft was a gift to enemy pursuers, but an enemy caught between two rising forces became an opportunity. The Japanese hangers-on soon realized their mistake. They had drifted too far west, too far from their fallback route, too close to the new American wave. Several of them accelerated sharply, engines shrieking as they attempted one final angle on Miller before breaking away, but they arrived too late. Reinforcement P-40C tore across the gap, forcing them into abrupt evasive turns. The sky lit up with intersecting lines of tracer fire, American fighters stitching the air, Japanese fighters scattering. For the first time since the confrontation began, Miller felt the sky loosen around him, breathing space, altitude he didn't have to fight for, air that wasn't filled with threat. He eased back on throttle, coaxing the Warhawk into a long, gentle withdrawal. The aircraft responded sluggishly, like a boxer staggering on bruised legs, but it responded. The controls trembled, yet remained obedient. Below, the sunlight caught the wings of retreating Japanese fighters as they streamed away in long arcs. The attack had failed. Altitude pulped the still, not through overwhelming firepower, not through numerical equality, but through delay, through disruption, through one pilot forcing an entire strike force into disorder. The American fighters swept past him in formation, their engines sharp and clean compared to the rattling pulse of his own. He felt no embarrassment in falling behind them. That was their role now. His part in the story had cost him almost everything. The Warhawk dipped slightly, its right wing losing lift for a moment before Miller corrected the roll. The pain in the fuselage was growing more obvious. small internal stresses accumulating at the seams. He knew what that meant. He needed to begin the return. Immediately, he banked southward, following the line of the valley as it opened into broad rolling plains. Smoke trails marked where Japanese fighters had gone down. Oil slicks glimmered faintly in distant river bends. The sky that had been a furnace minutes earlier was turning strangely quiet, the way a battlefield feels after the last explosion fades. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but exhausted, drained, as if even the air needed time to recover. Miller's Warhawk limped forward, engine coughing in irregular pulses. The stick felt heavy, the pedals stiff, but through that fatigue, one undeniable truth carried him home. He had done more than survive. He had turned a massacre into a delay into a disruption into salvation for thousands. Behind him, the broken remnants of the Japanese strike disappeared into the horizon. Ahead of him, the distant outline of Kunming's ridges beckoned, proof that the sky he had defended was still American. The battle was ending, but the landing would decide if the story survived. The flight back toward Kunming stretched longer than any distance Miller had ever flown, even though the airfield lay only minutes away. What remained of his Warhawk felt less like a machine and more like an exhausted companion on the verge of collapse. The engine sputtered in uneven surges, as though each combustion cycle were now a negotiation with fatigue, rather than a certainty. Oil streaks crawled across the canopy, shimmering dark and iridescent when the sunlight caught them. Bullet holes along the fuselage whistled in thin high notes as the wind forced its way through torn metal. The mountains below rolled gently at first, then rose again into steep ridgelines that demanded altitude he barely had. Every climb felt like lifting a wounded animal. Every turn carried the weight of a machine stretched to its final tolerance. But every mile carried him closer to the place he had saved, not by destroying the enemy, but by denying them the time they needed to strike. As the Warhawk limped across the last ridge, the faint outline of Kunming's airfield emerged from the valley floor. Even from a distance, he could see the flurry of activity, ground crews moving equipment, fuel barrels being lined up, medics jogging between tents, aircraft being prepared for scramble. Life. Order. A working airbase. All of it still standing because the Japanese strike had broken apart before reaching this valley. It wasn't triumph he felt. It wasn't pride. It was the deep, quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent everything. He eased the throttle back, allowing the engine to cool in the thin air. The temperature gauges dipped slowly, but the vibrations remained, reminding him that the margins were razor thin. Landing would demand the last of his control, his focus, his precision. A damaged P-40 was a stubborn creature during descent, prone to unpredictable drops in lift and sudden lateral roll. With holes torn in its control surfaces and scars lining its wings, the aircraft had become even more volatile. But it was still flying. He lowered the landing gear. The mechanism groaned, hesitating as though unsure whether it could obey. Then, mercifully, the wheels locked into place. He felt the shift in the Warhawk's balance, a subtle change in the way the aircraft held itself in the air. The runway stretched ahead, pale and uneven in the morning light. As he descended, he noticed figures gathering at the edge of the airstrip, crewmen in grease-covered uniforms, officers with binoculars, Chinese laborers, wiping their hands on worn cloth aprons. They all looked upward, shading their eyes against the sun. The Warhawk's damaged silhouette told them everything. They knew the story before he even touched down. The landing was rough, hard, violent. The wheels hit the ground with a heavy thud, bouncing once before settling. For a moment, the right wing dipped dangerously low, nearly scraping the dirt, but Miller corrected it just in time. The Warhawk rolled forward in a long uneven skid, slowing until it finally shuddered to a halt in the center of the runway. Silence followed, a heavy, unreal silence. Then the ground crew sprinted forward. Hands pulled open the canopy. Voices he barely heard called out. Someone tapped his shoulder, unsure if he was conscious. He lifted his head, nodded once. Only then did the weight of what he'd done begin to press into him, not as glory, but as gravity. The gravity of survival. The gravity of choices made alone in the sky. The gravity of knowing he had stood between 64 enemy fighters and the destruction of everything behind him. Over the next hours, intelligence officers pieced together the scope of the battle. They tracked fuel consumption patterns. They reviewed intercepted radio fragments. They analyzed the Japanese flight paths. The conclusion was inescapable. The strike was shattered because one man forced an entire formation to break discipline. Their timing failed. Their fuel windows collapsed. Their attack vectors splintered. Their numerical advantage dissolved into chaos. Kunming lived because a single fighter had held the sky long enough for reinforcements to rise. In the days that followed, Allied units confirmed wreckage scattered across mountain ridges and forested valleys. Japanese reports later revealed the scale of their losses, not catastrophic, but damaging. More importantly, the attack had failed without ever reaching its target. Miller wrote nothing about it in his logbook except for the bare minimum: intercepted enemy formation, heavy opposition, returned with damage. He never inflated the story, never shaped it into legend, never spoke in dramatic terms. Pilots of his era rarely did. They measured success not in kills or medals, but in whether the people behind them survived another day. Years later, when the war was over and the airfields of Kunming had become memories, the story resurfaced in scattered reports, intelligence notes, declassified documents, a footnote in history. But to those who lived in Kunming that morning, to the men who saw the smoke trails in the sky, to the ground crews who watched a ragged P-40 stagger home, it was never a footnote. It was the reason they were still alive. One Warhawk, a sky filled with enemies, and a pilot who refused to let them pass. That was his legacy. Not the victory, not the numbers, not the heroism. The refusal, the resistance, the impossible defiance, the kind of act that echoes long after the sky goes quiet.